Any moment in history in any language. We can argue about the language, right? Do we use the English word for two or the French word for two or whatever other word might, catch your fancy? But the concept of two, the concept of plus, actually those two concepts alone will render you the concept of 4, and then 6, and then 8, etc., etc. And that is true. It is logically true, it is undeniable, and it can be demonstrated. Now the neat thing would be whether or not we can actually demonstrate that ethical arguments have a structure that is similar to that. And I will tell you, the only bias I bring to the table is that ethics, doing ethics, and I like to think of ethics as a verb rather than a noun, that doing ethics, the process that it is like psychoanalysis. It's interesting for me to know why you feel the way you do, but frankly, it doesn't matter, because there will be truth propositions that we can either demonstrate as being correct or incorrect. So we need to talk about how does ethical argument actually work. A process that we can use to bring us consistently to answers about ethical questions, and whether or not that process can be taught. If you're a freshman in college, you probably doubt the first argument that I made, the first proposition that I present to you, which is that there is a truth value to an ethical statement. Subjectivity reigns heavy in the young mind. We can easily disabuse you of that notion. I used to be a college professor, by the way, and first day intro to ethics, there was invariably someone who would say, "Oh man, who are you to tell me what's right or wrong? Whatever floats your boat. Subjectivity. I'm a subjectivist." I say, "Oh, okay, fine. Today we are going to declare open hunting season on people who wear purple ties and gray jackets." Mine's blue, so I'm safe. All right. So immediately the student would say, "Whoa, you can't do that." What do you mean I can't do that? You just told me there were no rules. You told me I could do whatever I wanted. Well, no, but you can't do something that hurts me. Oh, so there is a rule. Very quickly, subjectivity goes down the drain, right? But those of you who are professionals already working out in the field probably make a mistake that is equally as dangerous, but on the opposite side, because you've probably grown very, very reliant on an intuitive approach to ethics. You've seen a lot of cases and you sort of feel like you know what's right, and someone asks you for advice about a case and you give an answer. Now you might be right, but then again, if we don't know why you're right, you might as well be wrong. In fact, you can be more dangerous when you're right and you don't know why you're right than you will be if you're wrong and we can have a productive conversation about the matter. So the why is much more important than the what. We can make a mistake in any particular case, and if we have a reliable process for verifying our judgment, we will be able to discover our own mistakes and fix them. But if we're just running on our gut because 20 years practicing medicine has told me that this is what I do, then we have no teachable process. We have no reliable method for testing the veracity of any particular position, and someday your gut will let you down, and it will let you down big. So we need to wonder what the process is that could be taught so that people can actually have a logical approach to solving clinical ethics problems. And then finally, we'll be asking, or I'm going to leave this one as an open question, I'm not really going to answer it for you today, but how will this improve the quality of healthcare? I can give you some quick little answers. First of all, clinical ethics is part of the standard of care. It is. It has been now for a number of years. The field is actually relatively young. We didn't really get ethics committees going until sometime in the 80s. Really, clinical ethics dates back to Karen Ann Quinlan, if you want to talk about a practical field. Obviously, there were philosophical writings about it earlier than that. But when you talk about the country as a whole, grappling with ethical issues as they present the delivery of healthcare, it's a early to mid-1970s phenomenon. The money was running out. The technology was outpacing our standard attitudes about how we want to live our lives. And the biggest thing of all, which we thank Ralph Nader for probably in the 50s, but certainly the 1960s, consumerism, a wave of respect for individual autonomy, moved over, it migrated from general life to medical life. It's my life anyway. I'm the patient, I decide. Old paternalistic medicine died hard. In fact, it's not dead in all places yet, but it dies a hard death when patients begin to assert their autonomy. The value of personal autonomy was a sea change in the way we think about ethics in this country, at least with regard to the delivery of healthcare. So you take reducing funds, expanding technology, and individual autonomy, and you've got a recipe for a brand new field to come into existence, and that's what happened in the 1970s. And then, voila. Now I can be gainfully employed as a philosopher and not be in the university environment. So there's no question this is part of the standard of care. There is no question you have answers to difficult ethical questions. There's no question that quality control becomes part of what healthcare is expected to deliver, which means that we need to be able to explicate the QI basis for the decisions that we make. It's not just enough that I individually feel good about it. I need to be able to defend my decisions when challenged by others. Those things can only be done well if the first two questions are answered appropriately. There is a method that we can use, and we can teach it to people, and we can apply it reliably and consistently. And so that's what we're really here to talk about. And I will tell you, because Joe didn't quite give you the full background here, I am a philosopher by training. My PhD is in philosophy. When I was getting out of grad school, actually, that's not true. I was specializing in clinical ethics in grad school. When I was getting out of undergrad, going to grad school, I didn't know if I wanted to really study classical philosophy. I also had a Greek major along with my philosophy major, so I was really into a lot of the ancient stuff, or if I wanted to do clinical ethics. And my wife said, Michael, Aristotle's dead. And clinical ethics is just getting started. So where do you want to run? And it also turns out that the classicist I would work with was on sabbatical leave my first year, so I hooked up with an ethicist and never looked back. I've been doing clinical ethics now for 23 years. That is being paid as an ethicist to support ethics programs in a variety of different healthcare settings. I've been doing it full time. I gave up my teaching position to go into this work full time 16 years ago. So it's been a long time that I've been running ethics programs, doing ethics seminars, consulting on ethics cases in community hospitals, in long-term care communities. I have my single largest contracts with the Commonwealth of Virginia to support the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, which means I am the ethicist for all of the mental health institutes, training centers, and all the community services boards, that is the community-based providers for mental health, intellectual disability, substance abuse, and prevention services in the community. I even have contracts with physical therapy and hospice providers. So I do a lot of this kind of work in a lot of different platforms. And I'm going to share with you some things that I think are common across all those platforms today. So that's just sort of my quick introduction, and I want to get to the argument as quickly as I can because that's the fun part. Does anyone have just any general questions they want to ask, especially the students? Is there anything about ethics you always want to know but were afraid to ask? I always ask that first, it's a dangerous question. Yeah?
Hi, so did you study any part of medicine in your training for clinical ethics?
Excellent question. Did I study any part of medicine in my training for clinical ethics? And the answer is that during my graduate work, no, which is one of the things that you're going to fix. Okay? Because if you're going to be offering good clinical ethics training, then there is no question that you need to be able to understand what's going on in a healthcare setting. Now, one of the first jobs I had, in fact, I came to Virginia because I had teaching offers in different parts of the country, could just go off and be in a philosophy department. I had clinical offers in other parts of the country, go off and work in a think tank or work with a medical ethics group. But I didn't know at the time if I wanted to be strictly clinical or strictly academic. I was still sort of finding myself. And Lynchburg, Virginia gave me a wonderful offer. I could teach at what was then Randolph-Macon Women's College, which is now Randolph College. They've gone co-ed. And I got a clinical appointment at the University of Virginia in the Department of Family Medicine to work with the family practice residents. I often think of my first 3 years out working with the family practice residents as my own residency. Because that was the time when I had to learn everything. I was at the residency constantly. I was rounding with the physicians and really getting a sense as to how medicine works. Because I got to tell you, you don't learn that in bioethics class. You read these articles that have these nice sort of rarefied problems, and what you don't really understand is what happens in the real world. If you guys here are going to create a meaningful certificate program or master's program in clinical ethics, one of the things that you're going to have to do is make sure that everybody has a grounding in basic medical terminology, that they spend some time in a hospital and actually see how the parts work, so that what you're turning out are people who have an appreciation beyond just the theory. So it took me a few years post-graduate, if you will. I was getting paid for it, so it was great. But it took me a good few years rounding with family practice residents, which was the best place for me to be, because I got exposure to all different areas of medicine before I really understood what was going on. I will tell you this. If you don't talk like a doctor, doctors aren't going to listen to you. So if you don't understand vocabulary, right, if you can't zero in on what the clinical issue is, then you're dead in the water. And I learned one lesson very, very early. I wrote my first ethics consult after I was out of grad school. I did do some, with my advisors, my thesis, my dissertation advisors when I was in grad school, I did go on some consults with them to hospitals. So I had had exposure to it. But when I went to write my first consult, when I was being paid to do this, it was magnificent. It was flowing prose that outlined in great detail all of the moves in every argument. It was a piece of philosophical work. And I learned right away, it is not what an ethics consult should look like. Right? No one is going to have the time or the inclination to get into a deep philosophical discussion about every move you made in the argument. So now when I write consults, and I learned this very, very early on, I have a paragraph that's a presentation. Patient X is blah, blah, blah. It sounds just like any physician would write it. Then I have bulleted recommendations. We recommend A, B, C, D. Then I have a discussion section. You want to know how I got to A, B, C, and D? Here it is. Here's the more protracted argument. But you want to just get cut to the chase? Here are the recommendations, and you'll know where we're headed with the consult. So you have to understand that you're working in the real world where people have time pressures, and they're interested in results. They want deliverables. Ethics is not a question of spending the next semester sort of cogitating about something, seeing how we feel about it, and then thinking, oh, well, I vented, so I feel better, and then moving on. We need deliverable results that are documented clearly, that go in the chart. And I can discuss that with you if you like, but they have to be in the chart. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So if we're going to affect the decision-making of a treatment team, we better have documentation about why that treatment team has taken a right turn in this particular case. So this is very practical, very pragmatic, very real world. It's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. Anything else? Yeah.
How often do you bump into either insurance industry requirements or medical research in your clinical ethics consultation?
Well, let's take the second question first, because that's probably the simpler one. For some of the facilities with which I work, they have asked me also to sit on their IRB, their Institutional Review Board. So when research issues come up, there are all sorts of federal laws about how you have to review the research, approve the research, etc. Probably many of you are much more expert in that than I was. Or that I am. I have spent a lot of time on the IRB. I used to chair the IRB when I was a college professor. We had a human research review committee, and I always figured, well, Mike does ethics. He's the perfect guy for this. But my point is that an IRB and an ethics committee are completely different animals, and we ought not to confuse them. You could have some overlap with membership, but they are completely different animals. An IRB is satisfying regulatory requirements that are very precisely mapped out. Okay, that is a verification effort. It is not a questioning effort about what the ethically correct thing to do is. It is verifying that certain steps have been taken, that consents are in certain places. Surely there are ethical questions that come up in research, and they might get referred to an ethics committee if you want to think about that before you submit your application to the IRB. But the IRB is a different animal. So the only research issues that have ever come across my desk as an ethicist, as opposed to as a member of an IRB, would be questions coming from researchers about potential research. And they're asking ethical questions about either the structure of the study, or more usually, the only ones I can think of have to do with the subjects of the study. Are these people truly in a position to give informed consent? Children, prisoners, people with diminished capacity, etc. So how should we think about that in order to help us structure our study, which we will then submit to the IRB? So the number of ethics issues that I get on research actually is very, very low, because those are usually fielded in other places. As far as insurance companies go, interestingly enough, you'll be shocked to hear this, insurance companies have never asked me for a consult. Who would have ever thought? but the insurance companies are not driving ethics. Okay?